Hey everyone. So this video is going to go over the PowerPoints for description and narration in the week 2 module under the description and narration tab. This might be a longer video because I am going to cover both PowerPoints in it, but just hang in there with me. We're covering some important information in this video. So hopefully you've already looked over the PowerPoints, so I want to hit some of the highlights. So in the first PowerPoint on description, starting with the second slide, what is description? We're talking about using the 5 senses here, right? So coming up with description and language that expresses what we experience with the 5 senses. The reason that we want to use description, you'll be including it in the narrative essay that you're going to write, is it makes a story come alive, right? It allows your readers to feel like they're right there in the moment with you. If they can imagine seeing and hearing and smelling and tasting the same things, then it just makes the story much more vivid. So that's why I want to take a few minutes to talk about description, because when you go to write your narrative essay, you are going to be expected to include description in it, right? So we are not going to talk about, how to use description if that's the dominant impression of the essay. So like if you were writing a description essay, that's not what we're doing. We are using description to support a different technique. So you are writing in the narrative rhetorical pattern, but we're going to use some of the techniques from the descriptive rhetorical pattern to enhance the narrative writing, right? So for instance, on slide 3, it says if you're writing a causal analysis essay that's showing the consequences of pet overpopulation. So if you're trying to convince readers that they need to, spay and neuter their pets. So you want to show the consequences of what happens when we don't do that. You might take a moment in that causal analysis essay to describe the appearance of starving dogs, right? So using the descriptive technique in that moment helps enhance the causal analysis essay. You're going to be using it in a narrative essay, right? So whatever personal experience you decide to write about, you're going to want to include descriptive language in the important moments of that essay. So there's 2 types of descriptive writing, objective and subjective. So I always tell students, think of objective description almost like a newspaper report, right? Who, what, when, where, why, the basics. We are looking more for subjective, right? Where it's a personal view. You're trying to elicit some sort of response from your readers. So you want to get into more, that's why we're talking about the 5 senses, and a little later we're going to talk about figurative language. That's the reason why we want to use that kind of writing. So slides 5 through 7 talk about some of the pre-writing strategies that you can use for description. Feel free to look over those if you haven't already. But what I want to go to is slide 8. Slide 9. Even though the essay you're going to be working on is a narrative essay, you still want to base your description around some sort of dominant impression. That just means whatever the main point of your personal narrative ends up being, whatever you are wanting us to focus on in it, use the description to help make that happen, okay? Use sensory language that will highlight those important moments and the overall point that you're trying to make with the essay. You want to come up with as many details as possible to begin with, so your pre-writing will help. The graphic organizer that's in the essay assignment packet, that will help as well. But once you have generated a whole bunch of different details that you could include in the essay, you then need to figure out which ones you actually are going to include in the essay. You want to make sure that you're including details that are significant and important, and that highlight moments of the narrative. Too many details can get boring, it can overwhelm the reader, and it can really bog the writing down. So you want to generate as many as you can so that then you can pick and choose which ones you actually want to use in the essay. You want to shoot for details that are vivid instead of vague. So that's on slide 12. Yes, you can say, at your birthday dinner, for your 16th birthday, the food was unappetizing. And that tells us something about the food, but wouldn't it be better to say the stew congealed into an oval pool of muddy brown fat? Isn't that a better picture of unappetizing food? It brings it to life for your readers, You can say filled with passengers and baggage, the car moved slowly down the road. Or, like the example here, burdened with its load of clamoring children and bulging suitcases, the car labored down the interstate, bald tires and worn shocks, emitting puffs of blue exhaust and an occasional backfire. That is so much more vivid. It's such a better picture. We can see that. We can relate to it, and it just makes the story more interesting. So you want to choose your details carefully, but then express them with vivid language, right? You want to shoot for powerful adjectives instead of too many adjectives. So the adjectives are descriptor words. You think that you would want a lot of those, but just like with the details themselves, too many can be overwhelming. So you want to be crystal clear with the adjectives that you use. Choose one or two that make an impact rather than a string of adjectives that maybe all mean similar things to begin with, or maybe just, don't cut to the heart of the description like you want it to. You want to use verbs over adverbs, right? So adverbs, adjectives describe nouns, adverbs describe verbs. So you can say she walked casually into the room and deliberately tried not to pay attention to their stares. Or you can say she strolled into the room and ignored their stares, right? So you're using solid verbs instead of adverbs, right? Why use the extra words, because now if you're using adverbs, you're having to use verbs and adverbs and prepositional phrases when you could just pick a strong verb from the get-go and not only create the image that you want, but be concise about it as well. Mary walked proudly and confidently down the hallway. Or you can say Mary strutted down the hallway, right? It means very similar things, strutted and proudly and confidently. But when you say she strutted, that creates an image, right? And a tone to it that that resonates with your reader. So something you want to keep in mind when you're creating the description in your narrative essay. Choose strong verbs that create immediate images in our heads, right? And then the last slide that I want to talk about is slide 15, the last slide on figures of speech. So when you get into descriptive writing, it gives you an opportunity to use figures of speech. So I wanted to hit on the three big ones, just to kind of remind you of them and see if maybe that reminder might help you try to incorporate them into your essay. So you can do a simile, which is comparing two things using like or as. You can use a metaphor, which is also comparing two things, but instead of saying, A is like B, you're saying A is B. Even though logically we know that A is not B, they're not the same thing. But by saying A is B, you're making the similarity, the connection even stronger, right? And then there's also personification, which is where you give human attributes to things that are not human. So that can be a fun way to include description in your writing as well. We're not doing a full-on descriptive essay though, so I don't want to really spend a whole lot of time talking about description itself. But I wanted you to have that base to work from, because description is so important in narrative writing. So that's what I want to go to next, is the next PowerPoint on narration, because this one gives us all the good stuff about the essay that you are being asked to write for your first essay. I want to pay attention, call your attention to the quote on the title slide of the PowerPoint. So the quote says, "There are only 2 or 3 human stories, and they go on replacing themselves as fiercely as if they had never happened before." I love this quote from Willa Cather, because it brings this idea that all the stories of human existence have already been told, right? We are just living different versions of them, right? But we keep telling our stories, and people keep reading them or watching them or whatever the case may be. And why is that? Well, it's because those people who are putting those stories out there have found a way to make it seem new, to make it seem interesting. So this leads kind of into that angle in your rhetorical situation, right? How can you take an experience that hundreds of thousands of other people have probably experienced as well? How can you tell your version of it and have it seem new and exciting or different, right? That's the goal of narration. So going down to slide 4 of that PowerPoint, we are using narration as the dominant technique for this essay. It is what the focus is all about. So you want to choose an event that has significance. You're going to share a single point with your readers. Now, it's couched in a story, but there has to be a purpose. Again, rhetorical situation, there needs to be a purpose to what you're writing about. So you might choose to narrate the events of an afternoon spent with your 3-year-old nephew, right? But why are you using that as your story? Well, maybe it's as a way of revealing how you rediscovered the importance of family. That's your point. The point is couched in the story of the day spent with your nephew, right? Or you might relate the story of your roommate's mugging, or maybe you were robbed. And why are you telling that story? What's the point? Well, to evoke the powerlessness, the terror of being a victim, how scary it is, right? So you want to make sure that you're telling a story, but the story has to have a point. What is your underlying purpose for telling us this story? Slide 5 gets into the pre-writing strategies for narration, and that's going to be the first big hurdle for this. It is coming up with the narrative events. What are you going to write about? What moment? What experience, right? So you want to think about events or things in your past that evoke strong emotion for you, but something that would also have a pretty powerful effect on your readers. Do you have things around you, like in your room or in your house or whatever, that might remind you of a significant moment in your life? Use those to your advantage too. We're also going to have our journals and our sample narrative essays that can help you come up with an event to talk about. But use the things in your everyday life to help you come up with an idea as well. Another thing you want to do is make sure that you're picking a moment, an experience that you remember enough about. I always tell students it's okay to fudge some of the details, especially when you get into the descriptive details. If you can't remember exactly what something smelled like or exactly what sounds were occurring around you, it's okay if you kind of take some creative liberty there and make some logical assumptions about what kinds of noises may have been going on around you or what you may have been smelling at the time. But as for the actual events of the story, you want to make sure you remember enough that you can tell a true story, right? You don't want to make it up. You don't want it to be fiction. So that might help you choose your topic as well. Like, well, I'd really like to talk about this moment in my life, but I don't know if I can remember enough details. So maybe I need to think about another moment from my life instead. So just something to keep in mind. You want to focus on the conflict of the event. And that doesn't mean that whatever moment you choose has to be dramatic, has to have drama. A conflict can be internal, okay? It can be between you and nature. Maybe you're telling a story about being caught in a tornado or something like that. It can be a conflict between characters, and it can be something that seemed like a conflict at the time, but maybe it actually wasn't, in hindsight. It could be something that nobody would think was a conflict, but you're going to make it seem like a conflict because you're going to be exaggerating it for humor, possibly. So something like that, the conflict, it's the tension, it's the buildup, right? You want to make sure that you're hooking us, along the way with that. And then, what kind of tone is appropriate? We're going to be reading lots of sample narratives. A couple of them are funny. So I want you to just be aware that there are different kinds of tension, different types of conflict, and a different tone that you can use with each of them depending on what you want your reader to walk away with. So continue to pre-write, use the pre-writing techniques along the way to help you generate the events of the story. And then you can also use them to help generate the description for the story. But once you figure out what topic you're going to choose or what moment you're going to choose, you want to make sure that you are identifying the point of the conflict, the point of the essay. It needs to be, we need to know what it is from the get-go, right? We need to know why you're telling us this story. Clue us in from the beginning. Why is it significant? Why should we find it significant? When it comes to the descriptive details and the narrative details, make sure you're including only those that advance the story and that advance the point you're trying to make. Don't bog us down. Keep asking yourself, is this detail important? Is it essential? Is this character essential? Is this conversation important, right? Does it help me tell the story, or am I just adding it in because I think it's supposed to be there? Summarize lapse in time. If you have something that takes place over 10 hours or 6 months, you are not going to give an account for every single minute or every single day of that chunk of time. So you can use signals of time passage. 2 hours went by, or a month later, right? Keep the story moving by kind of summarizing or moving us through things that aren't significant or aren't essential to the plot and to the narrative point. You want to make sure that you understand how you're going to organize it. Obviously, most people think that a story starts at the beginning and moves to the end, and you feel free to organize your story in that fashion. But there are also different techniques you could use if you want to play around with it and make it a little more interesting. You can use a flashback. So flashback is where when your reader starts reading, we're right in the middle of the story, right? So we may be a little lost, we may be a little intrigued, and then you take us back and tell us how it all began. It can be very effective. You can do a flash forward where we start in the future or at the end, and then you kind of bring us back and it continues in the present. So there's different techniques you can use to kind of make it interesting and make it different, make it appealing to your readers. I wouldn't pull any kind of pulp fiction craziness where the story is so disjointed and fractured and all over the place that it's confusing, but you can play around with it a little bit. So you want to make sure that the essay is easy to follow. Make sure that each paragraph is focused, right? That we're not lumping all different kinds of things into one paragraph and it gets confusing, you know? Use your paragraphs to organize the moments of the essay. Use your time signals, not only just for passages of long time, but in the moment as well, right? So first, then, next, after, later, you know, don't forget those phrases and those signals to keep your reader in the flow and aware of how the story is progressing. Um, Obviously, we've already said we want to use those sensory details. So going back to the description PowerPoint, creating important and significant details in the significant moments of the essay. You can also use dialogue, right? Dialogue really makes a story come to life, makes it move a little faster. But don't include dialogue just for the heck of it, right? Only include dialogue that is significant, that is impactful to the story, and that makes a difference, right? And then one other kind of detail that I always tell students to try to include in their narrative has to do with more of the personal aspect of it. So you have these sensory details that's going to help the story come to life. That's great. You're going to have dialogue that's going to help the story come to life. Great. Don't forget to share your thoughts and emotions, though. Let us know. I mean, you're telling us a story about something that is significant to you, right? Don't forget to tell us how you're thinking and how you're feeling in those moments, right? We need to know that. That helps us connect to you as well. You want your first or your point of view to stay consistent as well. You know, so you're probably going to be telling it in first person point of view, you know, I. But just make sure that you remain there. The biggest one though is make sure that your verb tense is consistent. So if you're telling it in the past tense, stay in the past tense, right? If you're telling it in the present tense, which is interesting to try, make sure you stay in the present tense. Don't go back and forth. It's totally your call. Just stay consistent with it. So we're going to take a look at several sample narratives. So you'll see all of these items, all of these characteristics that we just talked about, all these important elements, the description and the narrative PowerPoint. You're going to see these things show up in those sample narratives. So we're going to look very closely at the rhetorical situation of each sample that we look at, and we're going to look at the use of description. We're going to take a look at the use of narrative techniques, right? How did they get our attention? Was their point clear from the beginning? Did they include details that only advanced that point, or did they bog us down with unnecessary details? Did they move us through the story without bogging us down in moments that really aren't important, right? Did they leave us with a sense of significance at the end? So we're going to look at all those things with the sample narratives that we read and discuss, and hopefully all of that together will help you craft a personal narrative essay that shares something significant that your readers find significant as well. And if you have any questions about any of this or you want further clarification on anything, feel free to let me know. Otherwise, we're going to keep moving towards a draft of this essay.